You're tuned into Collateral Damage, the military families FAP and IDC leave behind. Voices have been altered, because in this system, honesty has a price. Let's jump into Episode 5, Ethics Under Fire, the Dual Role Crisis in Military Family Advocacy.
All right, so today we're diving into a topic that's, well, it's pretty crucial, honestly. We're talking about the ethics, or maybe sometimes lack thereof, surrounding the Family Advocacy Program, that's FAP, and the Incident Determination Committee, so IDC, in the military.
Yeah, and right off the bat, we want to make it super clear, this deep dive, not officially linked to the military at all. No endorsement, nothing like that. What we're doing is we're trying to understand the experiences folks have had, and we've got a bunch of information we're using to do that. We want to raise questions, important ones, about how this whole FAP-IDC process actually works. And of course, any opinions we throw out, those are just ours. But we're aiming for accuracy here, so if something we say sounds off, factually, please let us know. This is part of a bigger series, and today we're zeroing in on those times when the ethics specifically related to social work, those standards, might not be met, like where things might fall short.
Yeah, and at the core of all this is this idea, right, that social workers, the ones involved in FAP and ODC, they're supposed to be operating within this really strong ethical structure, supporting families, acting in their best interests, all guided by, the big book, the NASW Code of Ethics. But then what happens when things don't seem to be going that way? That's the question we're digging into.
Exactly. We're going to be looking at what might be a bit of a hidden crisis ethically. Like how could this system, the way it's set up, maybe have some flaws built in? And how could those flaws actually lead to some pretty bad outcomes for military families? I think a lot of people just assume, right, that professionals in these roles, they're always operating fairly. But maybe the structure itself is making that really hard.
So let's just jump right into what seems like a major ethical dilemma right from the start. What we're seeing is FAP social workers, they often end up being both counselors and investigators. And that raises a huge question, doesn't it? How can someone be both a source of support and someone who's assessing you for potential abuse?
Yeah, how can you wear both those hats at the same time? It's a bit like asking your doctor to, testify against you in court, right?
Exactly. It just seems like a fundamental conflict of interest.
It really does. And the thing is, social workers are generally expected to be advocates, right? They're there for the people they're working with. But then in this FAPDC world, they're also functioning as investigators, even if FAP doesn't call it that officially. And you know what really stands out here? The lack of that typical due process you'd expect. IDC findings, they don't always follow those rules.
So let me get this straight. Someone could go in thinking, okay, I'm going to get help, this is confidential, and then that very information could be used against them.
That's the worry, yeah. This dual role just seems to create this huge conflict of interest. People might think, okay, I'm in a safe space, I'm reaching out, but anything they say could be seen through this lens of, is this abuse? What's going on here? And this goes against, clashes directly with the NASW Code of Ethics, which is all about avoiding these dual relationships, the kind that could mess with professional judgment or put clients at risk of, being taken advantage of.
So the question for our listeners to really ponder is this. If you're opening up, sharing those difficult things, could you actually end up, without meaning to, incriminating yourself within this system? It's pretty unsettling to think about.
It is. And what we're seeing is this is a legitimate concern. Service members and spouses, they might share incredibly personal stuff, sensitive details, thinking, okay, this is a counseling session. These are licensed social workers. They're here to help. But then this information could be turned around and used in those IDC findings. It just makes you question the whole idea of trust in that relationship, right?
Yeah.
Can you really trust that what you say won't be used against you?
So we've got this huge dual role issue, but what other ethical concerns are popping up based on what we've been looking at? What else should people be aware of within FAP-ODC?
One biggie is informed consent. Are people truly fully informed that what they talk about could be used against them, potentially? Yeah, there might be some initial paperwork, sure. But the concern is that's not consistently reinforced by social workers throughout, as they continue to interact with people. It's like that first disclosure is just a formality, and then the implications, they're not revisited. They're not clearly understood. What do you think? Why might that be happening? What's getting in the way of making that better?
It seems like that lack of clarity, that ongoing reinforcement, it could easily lead to misunderstandings, right?
Mhm.
And a breakdown of trust.
Absolutely. And then there are breaches of confidentiality, which that's a whole other issue. Sensitive information might end up being shared with the service members command, and it's not always clear what the consequences might be for the individual, for the family. Think about it. Someone's career, their reputation, it could be on the line based on something they thought was private, shared within this helping relationship. This brings up a tricky question, right? How do you balance the need for the command to be aware of things with that ethical obligation to protect what a client has shared?
And then, like in any human interaction, there's the issue of bias, which has got to be a big factor here, right?
Oh, definitely. Bias and neutrality, or the lack thereof, it's a recurring concern. The idea is that social workers, whether they realize it or not, might bring their own perspectives, their own biases into how they assess things. And since these social workers are often the main source of information for that IDC team, any kind of distortion, even unintentional, it could have big consequences. It's like that game of telephone, The message changes as it gets passed along. So how do you think the military environment itself might be contributing to those biases?
Yeah, that's a good point. The context of the military, the culture, it could definitely be influencing things.
Yeah.
What about the way these professionals approach people who've been through trauma? That seems like another sensitive area.
That's right. There are concerns about whether trauma-informed principles are always being applied, sensitively in a way that truly recognizes the needs of people who've experienced trauma. They might be more vulnerable, and that needs to be taken into account. And then there's this really troubling issue, the potential failure to recognize DARVO tactics. You familiar with that?
Yeah, DARVO, it's basically when someone who's been accused of harming someone else tries to flip the script. They deny, attack, and try to make themselves look like the victim.
Exactly. So the worry is that some people, maybe those who are good at manipulating others, they might actually use the FAP IDC system to their advantage. They could pretend to be the victim, and then the real victim, they're the one who ends up being blamed, potentially substantiated for abuse. That's a scary thought, right? It raises questions about how well trained these professionals are to spot these tactics, to see through that manipulation.
Yeah, it seems like the very system that's meant to be there for families could actually end up causing them harm because of these ethical challenges. That's a tough reality to face.
It is. And to really understand how this plays out in real life, let's walk through a few examples, just hypothetical scenarios based on the information we have. I think this will help make the potential consequences clearer.
Okay, yeah, lay out some scenarios for us. Let's see how this could play out.
All right, so imagine this. A service member, they're talking to a FAP social worker about, normal relationship stuff, the typical stresses, disagreements, the ups and downs of any marriage. They're being proactive, trying to address things. But then the next week, bam, they're under investigation for emotional abuse. And it's all based on what they shared, thinking it was a safe, confidential space. Talk about a violation of trust.
Wow, yeah. It's like the whole idea of seeking help is just turned on its head.
Exactly. Or take another situation. A spouse may be feeling pressured, maybe under scrutiny themselves. They make a false allegation against their partner. And the partner, they're deployed overseas, totally unaware of what's happening back home. Can you imagine the powerlessness, the isolation of that? They can't even defend themselves right away.
Being so far away, unable to respond, it just adds another layer of injustice. And what about that DARVO scenario we talked about? How could that play out?
Okay, so picture this. A survivor of domestic violence, they bravely go to FAP, they're seeking help. But then the abuser, they're skilled at manipulation. They use those DARVO tactics, and they manage to convince everyone that they're the victim. It works. The real survivor, the one who actually sought help, they end up being the one who's substantiated for abuse. It's heartbreaking, and it shows how the system itself can be turned against the people it's supposed to protect.
These examples, they're so stark, and they really highlight how serious this can be. But the question is, with all these potential ethical breaches, why isn't more being done? Why isn't there more accountability?
Well, one major reason is that a lot of people, they just don't know about this. There's a lack of awareness, and the individuals who are labeled as offenders in the system, they might feel, understandably, a lot of shame. They might fear retaliation from the military if they speak out. So they stay silent, and that silence, it just allows the problem to continue because it stays hidden.
It's like that silence becomes a barrier to understanding the true scope of what's going on.
Exactly. And another crucial point is that military social workers, they might not be directly answerable to those civilian ethics boards that normally oversee the profession. So you have this gap in oversight, a lack of external accountability. It makes you wonder who's really making sure things are being done ethically within these military programs, and what happens if someone does something wrong?
Yeah, that's a good question.
Yeah.
What about the people within the FAP system itself? If they see these issues, if they try to raise concerns, what happens to them?
That's another concern. There's this idea that whistleblowers, people who try to speak out from within FAP about these ethical problems, they might face retaliation. And even when people do try to push for change, it's described as, maybe not very effective because of systemic issues. There's this analogy that's used: you can't make a helicopter without blades fly, meaning small changes aren't going to cut it. There needs to be a more fundamental shift.
It sounds like what you're saying is you need to rethink the whole design, not just make a few adjustments here and there. And what about the appeals process? If someone's labeled as an offender, can they challenge that?
Well, that's another problem area. The appeals process is described as really difficult. Once you're labeled, it's almost impossible to get that overturned, even if there were ethical violations during the process. It just adds to that sense of vulnerability, that feeling that the system is stacked against you.
So for our listeners out there, what does this all mean for them? What's the takeaway?
It means that service members and their families, they could be in a really vulnerable position. They might be subject to a system that doesn't always follow its own ethical guidelines. And a lot of people, they might not realize the risks until it's too late, until they're already caught up in it.
So let's switch gears a bit. Given all these challenges, what could real reform actually look like? How do we move towards a more ethical, fairer system within FAP IDC? We've got some potential solutions here based on what we've been looking at. What are some of the key changes that seem necessary?
One of the most fundamental things is due process. Everyone who's being investigated deserves due process. The consequences within the military justice system, they can be huge, life-altering. So the argument is those basic legal protections that we expect in civilian courts, they should absolutely apply here too. It goes back to the 5th and 14th Amendments, those guarantees of due process at the federal and state levels. The government has to operate within the law, and the process has to be fair.
Right. So if the stakes are that high, fairness should be a given. What about that dual role issue? It seems like that's at the root of so many of these problems.
Absolutely. The recommendation is clear. Social workers, they should never be in a position where they're both providing counseling and conducting investigations. Those roles need to be completely separated to avoid those conflicts of interest we've been talking about. That way, the focus of support services can be purely on providing help without that shadow of a potential investigation hanging over everything.
Makes sense. And who should be responsible for overseeing all of this to make sure things are being done ethically?
Independent oversight is key. Instead of FAP being solely under the command structure, there needs to be accountability to an outside ethics board, one that's not part of the military chain of command. That external perspective, it could provide a much-needed check on the system.
Yeah, that sounds like a vital step to ensure impartiality, to make sure things are being done fairly. What about the training that the professionals working in FAP IDC receive?
That's another area that needs attention. There needs to be mandatory, comprehensive training, especially in certain areas. Recognizing and understanding DARVO tactics, the impact of trauma, the dynamics of coercive control. These are all crucial areas where better training could equip social workers to do their jobs more effectively and fairly. And finally, there has to be a clear separation between those support services, which should be all about helping families, and any kind of investigative role within the military.
So let's get practical here. For those service members and spouses who are navigating the FAP system as it stands now, what can they do to protect themselves? What advice would you give them?
First and foremost, if you're involved with FAP in a way that feels concerning, get legal help right away. Don't wait. Second, be really careful about what you share. Think about the potential consequences of anything you say. And third, ask for an attorney or a personal advocate to be present during any meetings or discussions related to allegations.
Those are important steps. Anything else they should keep in mind?
Document everything. Keep detailed records of everything that's said, who's there, what actions are taken, and if you feel you're being treated unfairly, if you sense ethical violations, don't be afraid to escalate things. Go outside the immediate FAP IDC system if you need to. There might be an ombudsman you can contact, or there might be advocacy groups that can help.
At the end of the day, this deep dive is not about finding fault. It's about protecting families, military families. They face unique challenges, and they deserve support that's both ethical and reliable. Ethical social work practices are so important, especially in the military environment where stress levels can be so high.
Absolutely. If we fail to provide ethical support and due process to military families, the consequences can be devastating, long-lasting. It affects individuals, it affects families, and it can even impact military readiness as a whole.
So we really encourage everyone listening to think about what we've discussed today. If you've had your own experiences with FAP IDC, positive or negative, documenting those experiences and pushing for change, it can be really powerful.
Here's a final thought for you to chew on. Think about the power dynamics in the military, the hierarchy, the structure. How might the lack of strong external ethical oversight in programs like FAP, how might that unintentionally go against the very values of fairness and justice that the military aims to uphold? It's a question worth considering as we continue to explore these crucial issues.